Looks like attendees are starting to file in. Good morning, or excuse me, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Connors. I'm the Director of Customer Success at Ecobot. This is the fourth in our webinar series on the convergence of technology and wetland science. And we're especially excited about this one as Ecobot is an Esri emerging partner, and we have Esri co-hosting with us today. We've got a very interesting topic, predicting and field mapping wetlands, and a really great panel of speakers and industry experts with us who we'll introduce in just a few minutes. So before we get started, just wanted to remind everyone who's joined us before, we'd like to make this as interactive as we can be over Zoom. So please feel free to use the tools that we have in the chat and the Q&A to ask any questions that you have. And if at all possible, we'll roll those questions into the topic that we're speaking about. And we can always, have some follow-ups and some breakout sessions later if we can't get to everyone's questions. Also want to make a note that we're recording the webinar. So if anyone needs to come late, leave early, just want to catch something again, we will be sending out a link to all registrants with some instructions on finding the video over the next day or two. So I will kick it over to my co-host now, my colleague, Jeremy Schewe, who is a professional wetland scientist with nearly 2 decades in the industry, as well as the co-founder and chief scientific officer at Ecobot. Jeremy, it's all you.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna share my screen here so we can kick this off properly. And again, super excited to take this time to be joining with you all here again. This is our 4th webinar, and we're pretty excited with the level of interest in this. So I'm Jeremy Schewe, Chief Scientific Officer with Ecobot.
And I am your other co-host, Daniel Martin. I'm a consultant and project manager at Esri with a background in ecology and landscape architecture, where I focused on mitigation.
Great, and today we're going to be looking at prediction models and field mapping of wetlands. And so I thought we'd start off this way. This is why we're all here: water. Water is life. Our human body is made of up to 60% or more of water. 71% of the earth is covered in water, but only 3% of it is fresh. And only 0.5% of that water is actually utilizable, accessible, fresh water that we can use and survive on. That's a crazy ratio to think about: 60% of our body and 0.5% of the earth. And so I'm betting that's why everyone is here on this call today, because we're all looking at ways that we can better manage and plan for that 0.5%. So today we're gonna do a brief introduction to our panel and our presenters. Very brief touch into why we're doing this. Again, a very brief intro into Esri's ArcHydro tool set and also into Ecobot, but the majority of our time is going to be focused on our 2 case studies. And at the end of our case studies, we'll have a very brief touch in to our next webinar coming up in September and possibly into October. And then we'll have some time at the end for discussion and to field questions. And as Mike mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions, feel free to throw them into the chat box or the Q&A bubble down at the bottom of your screen there. That will, and some people might be able to handle those questions on the fly as we go.
We have a great panel lined up today, including Sandra Fox, Senior Project Manager with St. John's River Water Management District, and Megan Lane, Chief Scientist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Joining as panelists and presenters is Nevin Durish and Gina O'Neill. Nevin is a senior biologist for ESE Partners with over 18 years of field biology experience and 15 years of environmental consulting experience. He has a diverse environmental consulting background, including work in natural resources, GIS, and due diligence projects, with recent work focused on utility-scale renewable energy projects. This work has included sampling and assessing a variety of biota, including wetlands and waters, as well as wildlife such as birds, bats, small mammals, amphibians, and invertebrates. Nevin's work on these large-scale projects has been supported by integration of GIS into each step of field data collection in order to efficiently plan, conduct, and report field survey data. And Gina O'Neill, she joined Esri in 2019 following the completion of her PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Virginia. Her dissertation focused on the development of a wetland delineation model involving work in LiDAR DEM analysis, Python geoprocessing workflows, hydrologic and geomorphologic modeling, and machine learning. At Esri, Gina continues to leverage these skills by supporting spatial analysis projects related to remote sensing and hydrology, among others in the natural resources sector. In her free time, she enjoys hiking in her new home of Colorado and learning to bake bread. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here today.
And Gina may pivot and start shipping out bread to everyone. I'll be ready for it. Why are we here? The pivotal role of this webinar series has been to really help bring our attention to what we are really doing and what we're really doing. I'm an ecologist, I look for patterns. But it's not just looking for patterns in nature, looking at social patterns, looking at digital, looking at data patterns. And in the ecosystem of wetland science and technology, we are converting biological information and natural communities into digital data. And the purpose of this really feeds into being able to make better policy, make more intelligent planning, work with conservation, preservation, making sure that there is room for generations to come. We're giving a voice to aspects of our world that don't necessarily typically have a voice. And by creating that data, we are strengthening, we're bolstering that voice. We're harnessing the power of this new ecosystem for natural resource planning, monitoring, and conversations.
So as Jeremy was just articulating, the picture emerging in wetland science is one of interconnectedness and shared efficiencies. This new digital ecosystem is where a network of hardware, software, and science work together in the planning and conservation of natural resources. Before launching into today's presentations, we just want to take a quick moment and give you a little introduction to ArcHydro and Ecobot. So at a high level, you can see where these tools are located within that digital ecosystem. So what is ArcHydro? Well, first off, it's free, which is always great. ArcHydro operates on top of the Esri platform. For those of you familiar with the Esri platform, it's important to point out that this is not an extension. It's not a solution, but it's an add-in that primarily operates on ArcMap and Pro. You just need to download the ArcHydro setup, and that installs the toolbox and the associated resources. The idea behind ArcHydro is to provide a GIS framework for the development of integrated analytical systems for water resources. And there are several key elements to this. So it's a framework, not a solution for a specific water resources problem. It's geared towards analysis and not cartography. And it actually includes multiple resources, such as a data model, tools, such as the WIM, which we'll be hearing about today, workflows on how to best use those tools for particular use cases, and the community of users with common interests and patterns of use. The ArcHydro GeoNet page is a gateway to all these resources in the platform to share information and experiences. Here are a few more links and resources, but no need to worry about writing them down now, as we will have the links from the presentation summarized afterwards online for you guys to visit.
Yeah, so the same place that you'll be able to go to pick up the recordings, there will also now be a section starting next week where you'll be able to find these links for the resources that we are utilizing throughout our webinars. I just want to very briefly touch base into give a brief intro into Ecobot. So Ecobot is a field application that works on mobile tools that is allowing wetland scientists to complete their work in about half the time offline. And what we've done is we've streamlined the level of effort required to complete US-ACE wetland delineations via data collection, reporting, and field mapping of wetlands through our intuitive mobile application and our partnership with Esri, Trimble, and many others. Ecobot's integration with Esri mapping technology is allowing people to not only map wetlands in the field offline, but also when syncing via Bluetooth to sub-meter accurate GNSS receivers, and is really allowing people to increase efficiency massively. Also, our recent merger with Wetform has really helped position us as the front runner in the field application niche. And this is the new digital ecosystem for wetland scientists. And so with these massive levels of efficiency gain that we're seeing, and we'll hear a little bit more about today, Ecobot has over 10,000 wetland delineation reports that have been created. And those go from few acre wetland delineations, and it scales all the way up to landscape level and potentially up to nationwide wetland assessment projects as well. So we're excited to be helping people save 50 to 60% of their level of effort. So today, this is why most of us are here. We want to hear from our presenters. So we're going to take a look at 2 case studies. We're going to look and see how the combination of ArcHydro, of Gina's WIM tool, and Ecobot are having, like, how is this impacting landscape level projects? We're going to see how these wonderful tools combine to create those massive levels of efficiency that I was just speaking to. And so we will have time at the end for discussion and questions and answers, but without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker and colleague, Nevin Durish from ESE. Nevin, take it away.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on which side of the country y'all are from me. We're just right here in the middle in Texas, so glad to have everybody joining us. So yeah, I wanted to give kind of an idea with this presentation of, you know, where the field biologists are that are doing day-to-day wetland delineations in, you know, particularly in the consulting world, kind of where we're at right now, and kind of a tip towards where we're going. You know, really the goal with our projects, all of you who are consultants know, and even, you know, everybody knows you got to maximize your time in the field and try to, you know, make the most of it. And so what we're trying to do here is really just how can we multiply force and really make the best of the time we've got in the field. So with that, Jeremy, if you want to go ahead and advance. So a lot of the projects we work on, particularly here in Texas, we're dealing with large-scale wetland delineations, particularly for renewable energy projects where we've got extremely large footprints, 2, 3, even up to 20,000 acres of land that we're looking at and trying to identify, you know, wetlands and wetland complexes within. And a lot of these require extensive delineation work, oftentimes well ahead of any design for the project or anything like that. And it's, you know, the amount of time needed to actually do that in the field can start multiplying pretty rapidly. And, you know, just a general cost to do that can get out of control very quickly as you scale up in acreage. In particular, in the Texas coastal wetlands, we're dealing with a lot of widespread wetland complexes, often where we've got a bunch of isolated features that really don't connect to anything downstream, where they're isolated depressions. So with that, Jeremy, if you want to go ahead and advance. We've got, you know, field data we need to collect following the 1987 manual, you know, running transects. Luckily, we have relatively uniform habitats that we're working in. A lot of times it's even abandoned agricultural fields, whether it be rice, sugarcane, something along those lines. The complicating factor for us in many cases, though, is that we're dealing with numerous smaller parcels that have been cut out over the years and everything. and resulting in, a number of different baselines that we have to run, and it starts expanding the number of transects very quickly. And again, we've got, kind of a interesting situation with these isolated wetlands that we're dealing with in the area. In advance, thank you. So in order to get out into the field, we want to prepare as best we can to really maximize that time, as I mentioned. So, a lot of y'all are familiar with, should all be familiar with at this point, the native data products that are available. So this is, data that it doesn't really require a whole lot of synthesis or anything. You can pretty much review the data, see what's out there. You've got National Wetlands Inventory, the USGS topographic maps, and NRCS soil surveys, looking for hydric soils in those. The only issue, some of these can be dated. The resolutions may be, the scale that we're looking at may not be a small enough scale to pick up the types of wetlands that we're looking at in a lot of cases. So that's one of the challenges that we face initially with those products. Once we move on to aerial photography, which has really improved, I know just over the course of my career, it used to be that the USDA NAIP, the National Aerial Imagery Program, came out every couple of years. You were lucky, some years it was 3-band, some years it was 4-band, that sort of thing. Now it's become, very consistent in what's presented to us, and we have the options for 3 and 4-band data. But it does require some interpretation and some knowledge, along the way of interpretation, particularly with the color infrared imagery and being able to read that. Some of the data also available, depending on the location, is some of the high-res imagery that you get from local jurisdictions. I know around here in Central Texas where we work, some of the cities often fly down to 6-inch aerial resolution, which can give you great definition. The only issue being that those, you don't know the exact frequency that those are flown at. They generally aren't flown quite as often, so they may not be as up to date as, say, some of the USDA imagery. Then, as far as the advanced data products go, and this has been growing recently, we've always had the national, I say always, but for a long time now, we've had the national elevation data set, which has been a good starting place, but the resolution is pretty coarse on there, generally 10 to 30 meter resolution. And it just doesn't provide quite the definition for some of these smaller wetlands with discrete hydrology. But as of late, LiDAR data has become much more readily available. Again, speaking specifically to Texas, the StratMac program has been implemented by the Texas Natural Resources Information Service, TNRIS, and they make their LiDAR data available freely to the public, and it's all online at this point. It used to be in the past, you actually had to mail them a hard drive and wait for that thing to come back around, and you needed to know exactly which tiles and all that. Now it's become extremely easy to just go pop in, download the data you need, and you're good to go. So a lot of the data, the LiDAR data, it's actually been driven by the need for updated FEMA mapping with newer floodplain models coming online, and that's been really driving the acquisition of a lot of that data and the publication of it moving forward. Go ahead. So for those of y'all who aren't quite familiar with LiDAR, basically you get a few different data products out of it. At least, and this is a screenshot from the TNRIS, Texas Natural Resource Information Services, from their website. But typically the 3 data products that are available are the digital elevation model, and that's usually a bare earth digital elevation model. They've removed clutter from trees, buildings, those sorts of things. You get hyptography, so the contour lines, and as well as a LiDAR point cloud that actually has classification information for that data. One of the caveats, I guess, with working with this data, you'll find very quickly that it can occupy a huge amount of space. I know storage is getting cheap on computers, but it's still, it can start adding up pretty big for these larger projects. Go ahead. So back to the projects that we're working on. They're typically located, a lot of the larger projects at the time right now are in the humid Gulf Coastal Prairies region. One of the interesting issues that we've got with that is we've got a lot of soils that are mapped as non-hydric but with hydric components. So essentially the NRCS soil surveys just aren't performed at a resolution that really helps us out with identifying these smaller pothole type wetlands that we've got. One of the other challenges that we run into is a significant agricultural modifications to the landscape. Levees, ditches, irrigation canals, those sorts of things. It's one thing when they're actually active and maintained, but once they've been abandoned, it can really throw a wild card into just trying to determine on a landscape what's going on hydrologically, where water is trying to flow, where it can't flow anymore. And trying to determine that can be extremely difficult, and especially if you don't realize that until you get out into the field. You can spend a heck of a lot of time just trying to chase down what direction things are going, because it is, at least in the area we're working, topographic relief is almost non-existent. The levees and canals are generally the minimum and maximum of the topographic relief in the area. Go ahead. So as I said, with the low topographic relief, additionally, the wetlands we've got there, I'm typically talking about freshwater emergent wetlands here. You know, we say coastal prairies, but we are outside of any saline areas typically. One of the other challenges that we deal with down there is we've got, you know, being historically farmland in a lot of cases, we've got widespread and abundant invasives. Forested wetlands down there are almost exclusively Chinese tallow. Additionally, even a lot of the prairie areas are just vastly dominated by Cyperus, the woodrest flat sedge. I think there's about 50 different names for that one, it seems like, but we'll go with USDA's for today. But you know, having FAC and FAC wet plants being so widespread, and generally just the humid environment and everything, you know, almost everywhere you go down in this area, you're going to have a dominance of FAC species. Even in upland areas, it really tends towards the hydrophytic vegetation. And as I said, you know, the mapped soils generally don't show the definition for hydric. That being said, a lot of the soils, once you get on the ground, particularly in the areas we've worked with historic agricultural work, almost everything ends up looking like hydric soils that we get into. So move forward. So as I was mentioned, so if you rule out our vegetation and our soils, because those are fairly consistent inside and outside of wetlands in a lot of cases, oftentimes we get down to hydrology being our real key indicator for these types of wetlands as to what's going to call it in or out. And we're talking about extremely minor changes in topography, where we end up with a geomorphic position, and that will allow us to make a wetland call either direction. And we're talking a matter of inches in most cases where that occurs. Here on the right, you can see an example of one of the pothole wetlands that we've got. This one's a little bit deeper. It's actually got some water, some open water on it, but we end up with a lot where the surface features are a little bit more subtle and generally dominated by emergent vegetation. You can go forward. So with that all in mind, with these larger projects, you know, as I said, multiplication of force, try to do what we can to make the best of our time in the field. We wanted to look at some GIS tools that are available for, you know, identifying where these potential wetland locations may be ahead of the field study. You know, if NRCS isn't showing them, if NWI isn't showing them, you know, what other, you know, and even some of the false color imagery just doesn't have quite the definition for us. What are other information that we have available? And I've been involved in GIS for all of my career and bounced back and forth. I started ArcGIS. I was just trying to think, it was 7 point something that I started ArcGIS on, if that dates things a little bit. But I've also worked in with QGIS using some of the tools and libraries that they have. One of the ones in particular is GRASS, which was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers originally, and Saga, which was developed by some folks over at the University of Hamburg in Germany. Both of those tools actually have standalone interfaces that can be used as well, but they're also incorporated into some of the toolboxes in QGIS. Go ahead. So understanding, the types of wetlands that we're really trying to identify out there, ones that aren't necessarily connected to downstream hydrologic features that are isolated. We've wanted to try to figure out how we can locate those ahead of time. And, reading through some of the literature and everything, really these can be identified as sinks throughout the landscape. And both the ArcHydro tools and the QGIS tools have some options available for identifying sinks, and a lot of times they're used for preparing data sets for further analysis. But what we wanted to do is just to see how, kind of how it shows up with the data we'd already collected in the field. We took our original LiDAR DEMs, filled sinks on those, and then just made a subtracted difference grid that essentially shows us the depth of the sinks. And it's been really helpful for us to kind of tease out, some of these deeper depressions that we've got, even some of the shallower ones. And with that, I don't have a scale on here, and that's cartographically obviously a big no-no. Apologize to the ArcGIS folks. But we're talking even so with the pothole wetlands that are shown, the deepest one comes up maybe a foot below the surrounding landscape. So really, really small differences in topography that we're talking about here. So if we move forward. One of the other tools, and this is really where we're trying to figure out what's going on with some of that historic agricultural work that's happened in these areas. Looked over to the topographic wetness index. It basically, you take a model where you determine the catchments within the area based on the digital elevation model, as well as the slope for those off that digital elevation model, and calculate the topographic wetness index for it. And it's generally meant for steeper sloped areas, but we did find that it did a very good job of highlighting where these agricultural improvements had been made historically. The image that you can see down at the bottom, many of those, the straight line ditches are almost invisible when you're on the ground. It's, we're talking maybe 6 inches of topographic difference there. And, when it's all covered in sedges, deep-rooted flat sedge, you can't see them at all. And so it was very helpful in determining where some of these areas are and where water tends to collect on the landscape there. And just threw a mention in there, there's Saga has their own wetness index that uses a kind of a modified catchment scheme to map the catchments there, but it's very similar to the topographic wetness index. So with that, we took the TWI maps and our sink difference DEM out into the field, and Jeremy, you can go ahead. So we also combined that with some of the natural color and color infrared data to really hone in on what parts of the area needed additional work. We targeted specific wetland areas that kind of met the criteria of having, a aerial signature that looked like it had potential, as well as where the 2 indices that we used were showing increased signs of wetness and lower topography. and use that across the site to go and actually target which wetlands we wanted to look at, and had a lot of success with that. One of the drawbacks that I see right now, though, is we're using these as essentially a qualitative assessment. We haven't advanced to the point where we've got a quantitative cutoff where we can say, okay, if the wetness index is, you know, X number, then that's where we need to draw the line. We don't have anything like that we're using at this point. You know, the other drawback is that it does require some knowledge, significant knowledge of the site already, and just generally the local landscape. I don't think that these tools are in a place yet, the tools that we are using and as we've implemented, that they would be in a place where you could do just a desktop assessment for an area and be able to write off large scale chunks of a project without any sort of field verification. But we found them to be significantly helpful in, you know, as a field based map data source, particularly when you get into a pinch trying to run and delineate a wetland and just figuring out, you know, what's the topography doing? Because as you can see from the picture on the right, that's the actual view that you get on the ground about 90% of the time from these areas. And you've got to have some other map sources to really help you tease out what you're going to be doing in the field from there. You can go ahead. So what does that actually mean for the time we spend on the ground? We had a project that this case study is generally based on over 3,000 acres that required routine wetland delineation. We recorded over 250 wetland data forms in Ecobot, mapped over 90 aquatic features. That's 14 days in the field with 2-person team, and recorded a maximum of 31 wetland points during a single day. So it really upped our efficiency. We're able to, you know, travel through areas, and, you know, we're able to do the transects as required by the Corps of Engineers with that additional knowledge of the hydrology in the area, of where the sinks actually are located, where water tends to gather a lot more than if we had gone in blind or with just the typical base map data. You can go ahead. And so, you know, moving forward, looking to test this in the field additionally in order to further determine what the wetland limits and how that may correlate to the sink maps and the TWI and Saga wetness index models. And just use whatever GIS tools are available. You know, I think the next presentation is going to definitely tip us in another direction as well on other tools that are available. And with that, that's what I've got. I've got one of our little friends there from that wetland site, actually, little alligator that decided to join us on one of our delineations. Thanks.
Wow, Nevin, thanks so much for sharing. That was quite the project.
Yes.
So our next presentation will be Gina O'Neill discussing her wetland identification model. Take it away, Gina.
Thanks, Daniel. So hi, everyone. My name is Gina. I am a technical consultant with Esri, and I'm really excited to have this chance to present to you guys the wetland identification model. So this tool set is a product of my dissertation work while at the University of Virginia, and I'm really lucky to have the chance to continue developing it and implementing it as part of ArcHydro with Esri. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. Next, please. So just a little bit of background. Next. So I'm sure I don't really need to pitch to this group why having accurate wetland inventories is beneficial. So of course, just this knowledge of wetland distribution and abundance is really important for protecting remaining wetlands. And not just that, but it's also required before any large land development projects through Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So it's on a lot of people's radars. And just looking quickly at that figure on the right of the drivers of wetland loss in the US, these are things that are not really going away as far as urban development, rural development. So this is a pressing need and will continue to be. So although it is beneficial to have wetland inventories, the process of carrying out manual field surveys are very costly and time consuming, especially when you have these very large areas. And furthermore, while we are lucky in the US to have this national scale repository of wetlands, i.e. the National Wetland Inventory, for the purpose of finding these smaller environmental planning scale wetlands, the NWI can be insufficient. In addition to that, the NWI was not intended for mapping wetlands for regulatory purposes, and it has been found to omit a considerable fraction of wetlands. So for the purpose of protecting remaining wetlands, we need to kind of look elsewhere. Next, please. And that's where remote sensing, or coupling remote sensing and machine learning, can come in. So in about the last decade, this somewhat recent collection of remote sensing data really offers new opportunities for being able to identify wetland and their characteristics quickly and at large or varying scales. So among the remote sensing data that is useful, there is multispectral imagery, radar, and light detection and ranging, or LiDAR data. And then of these, in the development of the wetland identification model, we really honed in on LiDAR data. So as you can see on the right, the green on that map is showing where in the US LiDAR data is available. And with this image being a few years old now, I'm sure that that map is more and more green. So not only is LiDAR data freely available, it's also really high resolution. So when we use LiDAR returns to create this digital elevation model, we can describe the ground at a resolution of about 2 meters. And from those DEMs, we can describe flow convergence and patterns of near surface soil moisture, all things that could tip off where wetlands are likely to be. And finally, machine learning models can be used to learn the different rules or topographic characteristics that make up a wetland, and then use those rules to unseen areas to predict new wetlands. Next, please. And so those two principles bring together, or those two principles are coupled for the wetland identification model, or the WIM. So basically the WIM aims to use both LiDAR-derived wetland indicators and machine learning to identify likely wetland areas, specifically at this environmental planning scale. Next, please. So the WIM is implemented as an ArcHydro toolset, as you can see. So there's 3 main portions to this process. There's a pre-processing, a predictor variable calculation, and then a classification and accuracy assessment. And in order to run the WIM, you need 3 key inputs. So one of those being a high resolution DEM, or likely a LiDAR-derived DEM. Second being a raster that shows you where surface water or streamlines or blue lines are. And then third is a ground truth raster, which essentially is going to teach your model how to identify wetlands by comparing things to these ground truth areas of known wetland and non-wetland. So again, this process is automated and implemented as an ArcHydro toolset, which you're seeing on the right there. So each of the different components are made into a script tool. And then to execute the entire process in one step, you can also trigger these tools in succession using the model builder that it's implemented within. Next, please. So now going into some more detailed parts of the WIM workflow, and starting with pre-processing. So I would say a key component that the WIM offers is some different methods for applying smoothing to your input DEMs. So when we're working with these really high resolution DEMs, we can run into an issue of micro topographic noise, where the more and more derivatives that we take from the DEM, the more noise and highly detailed changes in topography that we'll notice, and might actually deter, or might actually get in the way of just focusing on those topographic changes that indicate wetland formation. And you're seeing an example of that on the right. So here you're seeing the same transect along a wetland, and where that wetland hits is outlined in red. And along that transect, the curvature derived from a LiDAR DEM. And you can see how that curvature changes when you along the wetland transect when you apply no smoothing to the input DEM, and going on as you apply a mean, a median, a Gaussian, and then a proanomalic smoothing. This is all essentially to show that by introducing this pretty key pre-processing step of smoothing your DEM before taking the derivatives from it, you can really prepare the topographic surface in the way that best represents wetland formation and kind of scales down those topographic variations that aren't as important for this application. Next, please. And now going into the second part of the workflow, so deriving these different predictor variables. And so there are 3 predictor variables used in the WIM, and each of them are used as a proxy to show where water is likely to flow and where it's likely to stay. So the first one is one that Nevin also talked about, the Topographic Wetness Index, or TWI. And this input is essentially looking at the ratio of an area, or comparing an area's tendency to accumulate water to its tendency to drain water. So again, where in our landscape is water likely to flow to, and where is it also likely to stay there? Next, please. The next one we use is curvature, which again is a pretty common one. So this one just looking at the second derivative of the topographic surface and using that to teach the model, or to allow the model to learn what parts of the landscape are convergent or divergent, and how does that coincide with wetland formation. Next. And the last predictor variable is a depth to water index. So this is a newer wetness index that has been used for wetland identification. And this is where that streamline data comes into play. So with the DTW, the model is assuming that areas that are very flat and topographically close to streamlines are more likely to be saturated. So again, just another indicator of where is that near surface soil moisture most likely to be. Next, please. And so just kind of coming back out to the bigger picture again, each of these 3 predictor variables are all being derived from that LiDAR DEM. And then before it is ingested into this machine learning portion of the workflow, they are combined, which you're seeing on the right there, as this 3-band composite image where each band of that raster is storing the information from one of those 3 predictor variables. Next, please. And that brings us to the core part of the workflow, which is the machine learning or the random forest classification. So just to give an overview of what random forest is, they are based on decision trees. So here you're just seeing an animation of what a decision tree does. So having a feature space on that X and Y coordinates, and then knowing the categories that each of those different icons belong to. The decision tree is basically trying to identify splits in all of those features so that at the end it can categorize all of the input data into groups that are as different as possible to each other, and that within each group all the features are as similar to each other as possible. Next, please. And so how does that translate to our application of wetlands? So if we're looking up in that upper left-hand corner, imagine that we have all of our topographic data, and we're going to select that scattering of pixels to train our model. And we know that those red pixels are wetlands, and we know that the black pixels are non-wetlands. So we would run this collection of pixels through our decision tree, and the decision tree might start to look at the DTW. Are these pixels near water, and are they flat? If not, it's probably non-wetland. Moving down to curvature, are these pixels in an area that's convex? Yes or no, and it makes a more defined selection. And then lastly, it may look at that topographic wetness index and see if there's a high flow accumulation within those pixels. And so we would learn these rules for what a wetland looks like. And after training itself on this kind of testing or training set, it would be able to apply the same rules to a new area where we do not know wetland and non-wetland. Next, please. And so the random trees, or the random forest algorithm implemented in Esri products as the random trees classifier, it takes that decision tree building block and takes it a step further. So beginning on the left-hand side with that same collection of known wetland and non-wetland pixels, it will take bootstrap samples of that training set. So that means that we're going to split that one group of known wetland of ground truth pixels into several different groups where we're going to select with replacement back into the main group. And from each of those bootstrap samples, each one is going to build its own decision tree. And so by having each of those independent decision trees, we we remove the risk of the model being very influenced by or being biased to the input data, and the model gets to see many different iterations of what a wetland could or could not look like. And the final prediction is a result of a majority vote of all of those different decision trees. So the advantages of this random trees classifier is that it is really good protection against having a model that's overfit to one area, because it does take those different bootstrap samples. Like I said, it reduces biases in input data, and then it also has a really handy metric at the end that tells you the variable importance. So essentially, it will tell you if we were to take away the TWI, what would our drop in accuracy be? And it'll do that for all of the variables. Next, please. And another part of this workflow is that it offers a flexible training sampling scheme. So you can split up your ground truth data into a training and testing set where only the training is seen by the model. And you can choose to either sample from your entire area of interest, which you're seeing on the left there. So just picking random selections of pixels there and using those to train the model. Or you could use something that's a little bit closer to reality, which is on the right, and limit that training data sampling from just a sub area. So on the right, imagine that all of the box there needs to be surveyed at some point, and we're going to send boots on the ground to tell us where the ground truth wetlands are just within those yellow limits, and use that data within the yellow to train the model. And then we're going to apply the model on the larger scale of that unknown area. Next, please. And so that brings us to the final portion of the workflow, the accuracy assessment portion. And I just wanted to quickly touch on this as accuracy assessment for any machine learning model. It's important to specify that this machine learning model is trying to detect anomalies in the landscape. So typically you're going to have a lot more non-wetland area than you are wetland area. So the WIM was designed keeping in mind that we want to have a very transparent and representative accuracy assessment that won't mislead the user thinking that an area that is predicted to be all non-wetland is very accurate, just because most of the area is non-wetland. So that points us to these two key metrics that the accuracy assessment portion of the workflow uses. So one is high recall on the left there. So if you imagine that blue area delineates your predicted wetland, and then that red outline is where the true wetland is. This would be an example of high recall because we have captured a large portion of that true wetland. And then in the middle, we have precision. And so precision, or having high precision would look like being very strict or very conservative with your predictions, but you're going to try to be correct as often as possible. So what you're seeing there, where the predicted wetland is very tightly within the true wetland boundaries, we're not making a lot of over predictions. That's a high precision scenario. And then ideally a model would have high recall and high precision. So again, that ideal scenario where we have encompassed a lot of the ground truth wetlands, but we're also really scaling back our over prediction. Next, please. And so now just going through some example outputs from the WIM. So the WIM provides two main outputs, one being those kind of binary predictions, wetland or non-wetland, and that's what you're seeing on the left. So on the left, the gray areas are where the model has predicted non-wetland, and the blue areas is where the model has predicted that there is a wetland. And the red outline shows where those wetlands actually are in the landscape. So we can definitely see that we are in some areas pretty tightly adhering to those true wetland boundaries. In some other areas, we've predicted a wetland where there isn't actually one. So maybe some over prediction. So maybe some other input data would need to be introduced there to remove that over predictive tendency of the model. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the other type of output that the WIM has, which is this wetland probability raster. And this output, instead of categorizing each cell into a binary wetland or non-wetland, it is instead showing you on a scale of 0 to 1 what the model's probability is that that cell belongs to the wetland class. So here you can kind of see, you know, of the entire wetland prediction, where was the model most confident that it is a wetland? So this could be really important for decision makers in deciding we want a model with really high precision and we really want to limit over prediction. So maybe we just focus on the cells where the model is at least 80% positive that there's a wetland there. And then of course, vice versa. Next, please. And just wrapping up now. So taking a step back and looking at what the LIM in its current form can contribute to those following similar applications. So one, the LIM is meant to be a flexible workflow, and it's well suited for the model development phase. So it's certainly meant to be built on. It's still, and it allows users to, add in different wetland indicators. If maybe you're in a low relief area like Nevin's study area, and you want to use vegetative indices instead of topographic drivers. In its current form, the LIM has shown that it has the ability to serve as maybe a wetland screening tool. So although we have that moderate over prediction, it has that high wetland coverage. So maybe we use the LIM in its current form as a screening tool where for a large area that needs to be surveyed, we run the LIM, and in that way we can scale down the area that or target the area where we want to do manual surveys. Next, please. And finally, just some key capabilities new capabilities that the LIM offers within the Esri suite of tools. So one is some DEM smoothing methods that are specific to improving the landscape for wetland identification. Second is some more robust outputs from the random forest algorithm, including that sliding scale wetland probability raster that we looked at. And finally, an accuracy assessment that is really targeted to describing how good an anomaly detection application is. Next, please. And yeah, so with that, thank you guys very much. Again, it was great to be part of this webinar. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Gina. Well done. Super exciting. I think a lot of people were really looking forward to seeing this combo. So pretty powerful tool you've come up with there. It's kind of fun to look at it from the opposite side. I come from boots on the ground, and then like you're coming from this macro scale. I'm just like, I don't know, it's pretty exciting to think, here we are, we're meeting in the middle.
Exactly.
So good stuff. Just again, touch base in September, our webinar is going to be focused on drones for field mapping and how those pair with field applications. And then in October, we're going to be looking at a webinar. We're going to take a look at another part of the tool belt in the ArcHydro tools. So more on that to come. So keep your ears to the ground for that. Just wanted to thank you all for taking your time to join us today. Daniel and I had a great time putting this together. Nevin and Gina both were just awesome to work with.
So it looks like we still have a few minutes left. And so I'd like to transition into a couple questions for the panelists. The first is for Gina and Nevin, as you both discussed wetland modeling. So how might best performing wetland models vary by region? And what additional data would be ideal for further model development? Gina, could you share any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that between my presentation and Nevin's, you actually got a really good look at how you might need to focus on different wetland indicators and different landscapes. So the LIM was originally developed for a few regions in Virginia where we can rely more on that topographic characteristics of wetlands. Whereas in Nevin's region or in more coastal regions, maybe a WIM model there looks more like one that looks at vegetative indices rather than topography alone. So I think that the models would vary they would vary by the input data used and maybe even the degree that you smooth your input DEM. Maybe in those coastal regions with really large isolated wetland depressions, you can use a more coarsely smooth DEM rather than an area with those linear kind of riparian zone wetlands.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Totally agree. I'm usually generally more focused on the South Texas region in general, and that's where we've focused our efforts for this type of work historically. So that's been the area of my focus recently. So can't really speak to the other areas of the country, but I think it would be somewhat applicable to more playa lake regions, somewhere like in the Texas Panhandle and going up through the Great Plains as well.
Great. Well, so I've got a question I'd like to put out that's in respect to, so love to invite Megan to speak in, but, looking at some of these tools that we've been looking at here today, how do you see that these tools in ArcHydro or some similar modeling, as well as field data and mapping applications, how are those things going to potentially help in the long term with data set generation for NWI, or at least improving some of those?
Sure, I'm happy to address that, Jeremy. So I would say that with NWI, we primarily rely on base imagery, typically aerial photography or fine spatial resolution, satellite data. But we also pull in what we call ancillary data sets, and we commonly look at digital elevation models. In the past, we use stereo imagery. Topography has always been a big part of what we do. Of course, water flows downhill. And so the types of products that both Nevin and Gina, generate would be, ideal ancillary data sets for NWI.
Yeah, and then Sandra, I'm thinking on sort of a regional basis, and with some of your experience with ArcHydro, how do you see some of these tools, especially this WIM tool, potentially impacting some of your all's work?
Well, from a water management perspective, I can definitely see applications for both of the tools that were demonstrated today. Of course, I have to throw in the limitations of available digital elevation models, and I see Gina's head nodding. That's going to be kind of the bane of our existence. I am looking forward to an opportunity to test that tool, but what I found most exciting from Gina's presentation was her use of the word current form, because I'm starting to see other applications and ways that this tool might be applied to other problems. And I like that use of the term flexible workflows, so that you could actually be using the same kind of format to answer additional types of, I happen to be in water supply, so what kind of questions, how this would apply. So yeah, these are wonderful developments for geospatial applications using ArcHydro related tools.
Great, thanks, Sandra. Gina, anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just kind of reiterate what Sandra was saying. It is certainly meant to be flexible, and it's in no way a complete black and white, this is the way that everyone should do it in every landscape. So hopefully if users try out the WIM, they'll see, or they will be encouraged, try their own input data or try to find something other than wetlands. It really depends on if you have ground truth data for streams, for example. Let's see what kind of topographic features or other could be used to identify or predict where streams are likely to be.
Great, thanks. And so one of the things, I'm trying to keep up with all the things coming in on the chat and the Q&A here too. There's a lot coming in. Whatever we don't handle, we will nudge into future conversations as well. But one of the things I do want to call out, just in respect to the DEMs and some of the LiDAR information, David Schaefer with the Army Corps of Engineers just chimed in a little bit ago in respect to a tool that might be available using the USGS 3 DEP LiDAR image service. And so he sent a link over on that. You're welcome to grab that. We will also save that link onto the resource page once we have posted that up here in the next few days, so that you'll be able to access that. And we'll kind of move from there. So one of the things that, just pinging off of landscape level modeling with this WIM tool and other such data sets that might become more available. Megan, this is for you again. Where does Fish and Wildlife Service hope to go with some of its mapping programs in the near future? I know we've had a few conversations on that just on the phone, just you and I, over the past 6 or 8 months, but maybe you could share a little bit there as well.
Sure. So, we are well aware that land cover changes and that NWI is not up to date, throughout the country. And that to some degree is, due to the fact that wetlands are hard to map and, our process is time consuming and we don't have the resources to carry on with, manual updates, unfortunately, with the resources we have available. And so we are looking to pull in more automated tools. I don't envision a purely automated process anytime in the near future, not considering the amount of classes that our data set supports. But we're hoping that some of the automated tools, such that, Gina mentioned and Nevin mentioned, can be used to, in some small but significant way, augment our workflow. And so that can be done in different ways. So for instance, with the type of data sets that Gina produced, again, those can be used as ancillary data sets, perhaps to kind of speed up the manual decision-making process. Or perhaps we'll get to a point where the automated processes can be used to generate foundational data that can then be built on using manual approaches. So we're looking for that optimal combination of manual and automated processes to get us to standard compliant data in as efficient a workflow as possible, efficient and cost effective. We're kind of after the holy grail. It's not going to be easy, but we're determined, and we are looking forward to working with all of you to apply the tools necessary to provide the data that we all need to, conserve wetlands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, always great having conversations with you, Megan. I really appreciate you taking your time to join us here today. I just want to let everybody know we are at the end of our hour. We have a few more questions still coming in. So if people are willing to stick around for a few more minutes, we will just continue in this discussion. If you have to drop off, I understand some people have meetings they need to get to, but please stick around for a few more moments. Someone had just asked how they can access the WIM tool. The WIM tool is part of ArcHydro, so you just need to access that through GeoNet. And so we will provide the link for that online as well, in case you want to get around in there and play with it. And as far as I remember, Daniel, that is something that is, if once you have a Esri license and you're working with the software, you can just access that ArcHydro tool set as a sort of an add-on.
That's correct, yeah. So I actually dropped the GeoNet link into the chat right now, so if folks are interested in hopping on that sooner before we are able to get the list of resources out, they can do so. But yeah, ArcHydro is a free add-on to the Esri platform, specifically Pro and ArcMap, and the WIM model is one of the tools that is contained within ArcHydro.
I know we've got a couple more questions. Gina, I might just bring your eye to the Q&A. About 2/3 of those questions are directly pointed towards you. So some of those you might be able to just answer on the fly there.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that I'm seeing that really jumps out, and this is from a pretty good friend here in the Asheville area, is what data set are you training the model on? Is it NWI, on field collected data? What are you actually utilizing to inform that machine learning part?
Yeah, so we initially tried training on just the NWI data. And although when the NWI says that there is a wetland there, it's very often correct. There is a wetland there, but sometimes it's just not exhaustive of all the wetlands in the area. So then we shifted away from there so that we weren't giving the model wrong information on non-wetland area. And so for that reason, I would say it's really important to use manually surveyed data that you're really confident in, both where the wetlands are and where the non-wetlands are. So in developing the WIM, we were actually using manual surveys that the Virginia DOT let us borrow. So with that, we had the exact limits that they delineated and all of the wetlands that they found within those limits. So we could be really confident in both the wetland and the non-wetland area.
Okay. Another question that popped up that's kind of a tangent to that, but have you tried utilizing WIM in any developed or urban environments? It seems like the TWI and depth to water ratio is a little more tricky there, was the question.
Yeah, we did, and we found that we had a higher rate of the false wetland predictions along roadways. So where we're our topographic indicators are actually finding like a, culvert or roadside drainage area rather than a wetland. And I think in scenarios like that really highlights how the WIM could benefit from additional data sources like just land cover classification. So we know to cut out all the developed area, or soil moisture information. So yes, it is certainly less accurate in those highly developed areas. And I think in those areas, it could benefit from ancillary data sources.
Great. Another question here is, this one's directed to Nevin, but how do you see some of these tools, as, such as combinations of WIM and some of the field application tools like Ecobot? How do you see those affecting planning and budgeting for larger scale wetland delineations on the regulatory side?
Yeah, I think what it's doing, and this has just been my observation in general, is it's front loading the field process a little bit more, of spending a little bit more time in the office ahead of time on, really trying to dial down on where your wetlands are, where your potential areas of concern are, and where you're going to be spending a lot of time actually in the field ahead of actually getting out there and deploying folks to the site. I know when I first started in this work, it was a lot more of like, take a look at a few maps. All right, let's get out there and do it. And now, actually spending a little bit more time doing some analysis ahead, and especially as with the large scale of some of these sites, you really need to be planning in advance. Otherwise, you're going to get it out there and not know what to do.
Yeah, so a little time and energy invested prior going in the field may really speed up and truncate the process of what you need to do on the ground in your boots.
Yeah, on the ground, and then in the back end as well. Once you get back in the office, you're a lot closer to being able to do your post-processing with your GIS data, and basically finish up your report, send it out, and we have seen it speed up on the back end side of things. Great.
One of the questions here, Daniel, I think this kind of goes back over to you, and I think we already addressed it, but somebody's asking what type of Esri licenses, both spatial or geoprocessing, are needed to run the WIM.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I might kick that to Gina to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that that it is within ArcHydro, which doesn't have any connection to those other extensions. Gina?
Yes. So I believe with Pro 2.4, you did have to install one Python package, scikit-learn, to actually run that random forest portion of the workflow. But with Pro 2.5 and later, that's no longer necessary, and all the dependencies you would need are installed automatically.
Great, thanks. Somebody was asking here, just comparing to some of the older methods used to develop the NWI, how much more accurate, and this, I'm going to give this to you, Gina, how much more accurate do you think that the WIM is for coastal or flatter areas, like in terms of efficiency?
So yeah, that's a great question. We ran into a lot of issues in the coastal areas, and what we found was if we applied a coarser smoothing scheme to the DEM, and by that I mean smoothing over a lot of kind of smaller depressions and just really leaving those larger, I guess, significant depressions. By doing that, we were able to really improve our wetland accuracy in those flatter coastal regions, but it is certainly harder to use just the topographic variables alone. That's part of this kind of classic model configuration. Compared to the NWI, I'm not sure specifically to coastal regions. I just know that in general, the WIM had a higher wetland accuracy, so it identified more of the wetlands in the area, but was not nearly as precise as the NWI wetlands were. So it could be a trade-off depending on what is the most important end result. Yeah. Okay,
great, thank you. So one for Nevin. The question is, I just wonder if you could use this type of office delineation work to complete an off-site delineation as discussed in the Corps delineation manual, with coordination with local district offices, of course. Seems like it's pretty accurate and significant. So
Yeah, I would say definitely preface it with talk to your local Corps office before spending any significant amount of time on that. I think, you know, I'm a field biologist. I really like to see some ground truthing. I understand the limitations, though, at times, whether it be land access for a number of reasons, and we can certainly deal with that in our neck of the woods. I would want to have a good working knowledge of other wetlands that are nearby if I were to try to make a case for an offsite delineation with that data. Very close by reference sites where you actually do have ground truthing available.
So just to piggyback off of that, Nevin, someone's asking if I'm not sure if this is for you, but in general, but any luck utilizing the antecedent precipitation tool from ACE to help justify jurisdictional calls?
I have been using it recently. One of the places I've actually found it helpful is with, and one of the things I didn't mention during my presentation, with the aerial photography of knowing the exact date that those aerials are flown is hugely important. And actually going back and running antecedent precipitation tool for the date that the aerial was flown. So you can see if you're seeing a lot of water on that, you know, the CIR data, was that a normal event, or was it flown, you know, during a heavy flood event or something like that? And we've actually got some sites where we've had some issues where you look at this aerial and it's like, oh my gosh, there's water everywhere here. Went back, ran the tool, and it's like, well, it was significantly wetter than normal, you know, during those times. And so it actually has helped provide some justification in some cases that, no, what we're seeing is not a normal event on those aerials that were being referenced regularly throughout a document.
Great. So I'm going to jump back over to Gina. And again, go ahead, Sandra.
I've been taking notes. What was the precipitation tool that you just mentioned? I'm not familiar with that. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no worries. It's the Corps of Engineers antecedent precipitation tool. I can probably dig up a link here real quick and post it to the chat.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So again, we're pushing time here, but we've got so many great questions. So I've got one more I want to throw over towards Gina. So one of the questions coming in from Kevin Stark asking about how do ephemeral and intermittent riverine wetlands play into the wetland probability surface? So flow accumulation thresholds, precipitation, groundwater dominated streams.
Yeah, great question. I think that, so right now the WIM in its final prediction, it doesn't distinguish between different types of wetlands, although that is certainly a direction I would like to see it go. I think to be able to, predict different wetland classes, one, of course, the input ground truth data would also need to have those labels inherent to it, but also additional input data, additional predictor variables. So again, soil moisture, land cover, vegetation, those would be the kind of extra characteristics I think the model would need to be able to distinguish between wetland classes.
Great.
Yeah.
Jeremy, do we have just one additional minute?
Yeah,
I
come
could
on
follow
in,
up.
Megan.
Thank you. I could follow up on a question regarding kind of the what you would get out of NWI versus WIM, especially in coastal environments. It's going to depend on numerous factors. So for one, it's going to depend on how up to date that NWI data set is. If you've got NWI data from the 1980s, it's going to probably contain a higher degree of uncertainty than, say, recently produced NWI data. Also, with the WIM products, you're looking at potential accumulation of water based on topography. So a lot's going to depend on what's driving wetland occurrence, what's driving hydrology in that area. There are going to be some areas where that small variations in topography at the land surface aren't going to drive hydrology, or are only going to drive hydrology, during certain, within certain kind of climatic regions. Also, you're going to have the structure kind of influenced by things like ditches. And so you might see kind of those depressions, but if the ditches are there, they're going to be draining those low points. And so again, the topography-based kind of wetland potential is going to be less relevant there. So a lot is going to depend on the quality of NWI data, and then also the landscape that you're dealing with. And so I know that's not a simple answer, perhaps not the one that folks want to hear, but my suggestion would be to look at both data sets and to decide which one works better for your area.
That's great. Yeah, I seem to remember there was a great presentation at the SWS conference in Baltimore last year that was kind of looking like side by side, like NWI and LiDAR, and they took like 3 different sets. I'm gonna have to dig up and see who that presenter was, because that was really well done. And I think it's important to weigh in, like the data can have be useful from different sets in different places where you have varying degrees of accuracy. So thank you, Megan. So one of the things that I want to kind of cap off with here is, again, there's a lot of questions that we still have not answered. I was trying to answer them as fast as I could, but they were coming in as fast as we were answering them. Which is great. It means people are really engaged, and it means that we're talking about a subject that's very exciting for both of us, or for all of us. Gina, a few people have been asking about your published works, and so if we will, in the resources section again for the landing section page for this webinar, we will provide links out to some of Gina's work. I know that some of the tools that Sandra has been working with is another part of the ArcHydro toolbox, is the Hydro period tool, and that's something that we're pretty excited about maybe taking a look at here in the near future as well, seeing how that ties in, because one of the questions that was asked here was, how will this tool be potentially helpful in helping to identify where sites are for potentially restorable wetlands. I guess we're thinking about changes in hydrology, how, where are sites that, whether it's a mitigation bank or a large public entity, like where can we do some restoration projects? So I don't know, maybe we ought to, Gina, do you feel like that's something that you can handle touching a little base too?
I mean, yeah, I think that the way that you use the predicted wetlands could vary. I don't think it's necessarily right to say that the predicted or the most probable wetland areas and use those directly as these are where the wetlands definitely are and where they are not. But I could see them, because the LIM does do a fair amount of over prediction of wetlands, that it could instead indicate, yeah, a good candidate for wetland restoration. So maybe there isn't a wetland there right now, but all of these different surface hydrology drivers mean that maybe it would be a good location for a wetland.
Great. Well, so I think a lot of you know that recently Ecobot merged with Wetforms. So pretty excited about that. And Pat Murphy has had a couple great things in here, and he wants to challenge you, Gina. He said, here's a real challenge for the model. Run in Alaska where almost everything is wetland. So maybe we can get you guys in communication on that. Thanks for that, Pat. Always a good one. So while we are pushing our time here, Daniel, any last thoughts or questions that you want to field before we wrap things up for the day?
No, I don't have anything other than to just thank the panelists so very much for taking the time and joining us, and all you folks who joined us on the audience side. Really great conversation that we've had at the end, some fantastic questions. So thank you all.
Yeah, agreed. So yeah, Megan and Sandra, thank you both for coming in. Nevin and Gina, great presentations. And Daniel, I've had a blast with you on this. Looking forward to the next one as we continue to find what is most alive and cutting edge in the convergence of wetland science and technology. So thank you, everybody. We'll hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thank you,
for
Jeremy.
inviting me.
You bet.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. Take
All right,
care.
thanks, everyone.